I'm Charles Galda, President of Vision New England, and your host for the Church in Action. This week, we're talking about innovative ways to do church, evangelism, and disciple making. And we're talking with Chris Backert. Chris is the Senior Director of Fresh Expressions in North America, and Kathleen Blackey, who has two roles. She's the Senior Coordinator of Communications of Fresh Expressions and a co-pastor right here in New England of First Baptist Church of South Londonderry, Vermont. Chris, Kathleen, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, let's just start with a little bit of bio for folks to get to know you. And so maybe, Kathleen, if we could start with you, just a little bit of your background, how you came to be at Fresh Expressions, how you came to be in Vermont and pastoring a church there.
Absolutely. So I grew up in central New Hampshire, and my husband and I, shortly after we got married, felt God calling us to ministry. And so we went to Gordon Conwell together. And we had a strong calling to northern New England. And so that's where we looked for churches to serve together. And we ended up at First Baptist Church in 2010. And so we've been here for almost 15 years serving our local community. And we love it here. We have no desire to go anywhere else. We love serving in this context. And we share one position. So I am part-time there. And a few years ago, actually about 7 or 8 years ago, I heard about Fresh Expressions for the first time and started doing some of the training with Fresh Expressions, and was really excited about it and started doing it in our local context. And about 3 years ago, Chris Backert sent me an email and asked me if I'd be interested in joining the team. So I've been with Fresh Expressions for a little over 3 years now.
Cool. And that's a great segue over. Chris, same question for you, a little bit about your bio and how you came to be at Fresh Expressions and where you are for folks who may not recognize the white wall behind you.
That's absolutely. So I live in central Pennsylvania. I've spent most of my life in ministry in the mid-Atlantic, so not quite New England, but New England realities are making their way southward all the time. And so we live here. My family and I do. I've been at the helm of Fresh Expressions since we started it here in North America around 2010. And in addition to that, I work with a church planting network called Ecclesia, a new initiative bringing evangelicals together across North America to unify, amplify, and multiply the kind of evangelical witness I think that we and Vision New England share. So I've got a couple different hats that I'm wearing today, but I've got a great team and a great support system. And thanks for having us here, Charles.
Appreciate it. Now, of course, many people will know Fresh Expressions already, but for folks who don't know it, what is Fresh Expressions?
Yeah, that's great. So the best way that I try to describe this for people is to get a little backstory. And so basically, Fresh Expressions was birthed out of the Church of England. And a lot of people find that surprising. But basically what happened is the Church of England had noticed in the late 90s and early 2000s a precipitous drop in what I would probably call traditional forms of church planting. And that is still a lot of the church planting that is being done today in North America. But they noticed that a real drop in the effectiveness of that. And so being good Brits, they decided to study the matter. The result of their study over a couple of years was two primary conclusions. One, they said that in the United Kingdom that they had reached the end of Christendom, and that the number of people that were going to be reached by our more standard approaches and models to church, sort of the come to us approach, had just sort of reached its limit. And yet at the same time, what they found were all these micro communities. They ended up calling them fresh expressions of church because of the ordination vows that Anglican clergy make at their ordination to proclaim the gospel afresh to every generation. And they found these micro communities were mostly alongside of existing parishes and congregations, and were reaching new people. New people were coming to faith and becoming disciples of Jesus Christ. So they sort of took the momentum of that report, and they did something that not a lot of denominational bodies do, and they put into practice their research. And they took what was happening on the edge of the church and put it in the center of the church. And that was the initiation of the Fresh Expressions movement in the UK. We began to develop a relationship with them a few years later. And that's a longer story than we have time here. But we began working with them to say, how are we going to launch this initiative in North America? And so basically, what Fresh Expression does is starts with a question: what are we going to do about all the people that are never going to come to our more traditional patterns of worship and congregational life? And that might be, Genesis Community Church or First Baptist, South Londonderry. What do we do about all the people that are just not likely to come? And so our sort of response to that is that we need a missiological approach that forces the church outward into the community to start new expressions of Christian community alongside of the inherited sort of patterns of worship and congregational life that we have.
So we're talking about folks who, for whatever reason, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock Sunday morning in a church building is not something that's going to get on their radar screen. And if it does, it's not going to get them to walk through those doors.
Yep, that's absolutely right. Yep. And no matter what we do, it might be liturgical, it might be high church, it might be low church, it might be abundant praise music, solid preaching. It doesn't matter. They're just not going to come.
And so the good news is you're in a target-rich environment, because you described more than 90% of New England. So, and in Vermont, you've described 99% of New England, right?
Yeah.
And so what are can you give us some examples for folks who are kind of hearing it definitionally, but what does that actually mean? What are some of the fresh expressions you guys have done or seen?
I think that there's been many different types. I know Loon Mountain Ministry in New Hampshire. They do a lot of stuff with skiing and snowboarders, but in the summer months, they have what they call dirt church. And so people who like to do mountain biking, they get together and they hand out snacks. They have a short message, and then they ride bikes together. So there's that shared interest. And so a lot of fresh expressions are around shared interests that people have. I know of another 5 churches that have collaborated, because we know a lot of our churches are small and volunteer help is limited. So these 5 churches, 4 different denominations, they get together and they do messy church together, which is basically people of all ages getting together and learning about Jesus through games, crafts, activities, music, storytelling from the Bible. So they make it doable for their situation. I know of another church in Middlebury, and they have what they call kinship groups. So they have like a crafters one, a bone builders one, and they're more concerned about bringing their authentic self to connect with others in some sort of shared interest, life experience, or ministry focus. I think they have another one that's like hiking. And so it gives them opportunity to invite people outside of the church and in a comfortable kind of setting.
And so is the idea that, if we go back to Dirt Church up around Loon Mountain, which is in New Hampshire for folks who may not know it, if we think about that, is the idea then that is outreach, and we're trying to connect with people in the context where they are introducing a spiritual component, because eventually we want to get them into the church building? Or is the idea that no, eventually this is that either today or someday this will be church for them, or is there a different end game?
I would say it's more that it would become its own church, that it would become, and there's a whole Fresh Expressions journey that you can go through that starts with listening, and it goes to having a full-fledged community of believers that are doing life and ministry together. If they come to the church, that's great. And my experience, we've had people who've come to Fresh Expressions from our church that have come, Fresh Expressions that our church has created, and then they'll start attending our church, but that's not the end goal.
And so the one you described on Loon Mountain is a devotional. Then we ride dirt bikes. Now, when I say we, I'm being generous because I'm not riding any bike. and so there's devotion. So at some point that was. Do you know enough about that you could tell us the journey? How did that start? and get to a devotional? Was it people who said, hey, we want to, would you come to our devotional? Or was it something that was organic and got a devotion added? Or how does it work? Or pick a different example if there's a better one.
Yeah, no, I don't know exactly how it started. I know a lot of the people who are on staff at Loon Mountain Ministry. I would say that in general, usually you would want a few people from your church that are kind of passionate about that. So for me, I love baking sourdough bread. I love all things sourdough. I will talk for hours to anybody who wants to about sourdough. So it would make sense for me to use something that I'm already passionate about to reach out to my neighbors. And like in a lot of fresh expressions, that's where you start. And usually it's nice to have more than one person who is passionate about that one particular thing. And so there's a lot of different ways that you can start. You can either just invite a bunch of people to go make sourdough bread together. And then eventually, as you develop in those relationships, you can do sort of like an opt-in, like, hey, we're going to do a Bible study beforehand. Other fresh expressions, when they start, they might say, like, from the beginning, like, we're going to do our devotion first, and then we'll bake sourdough. So I don't like going to things where, like, I feel like someone is like surprises me with something. So we don't want to surprise people. Like, we either want to give them an option to come to something that has a faith component to it, or we give them an option to come early or late to learn more about Jesus.
So you guys in that scenario, so let's say you've got 2 or 3 others and you're all talking about and baking sourdough bread, and you've got a devotional, and you're just inviting people into that because you find out, I also like sourdough bread, and I start coming to it, and I decide, well, I'll stick around for the devotional this week. Am I kind of getting the gist of it? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, Chris.
Go ahead, Chris.
Go ahead. I was going to say, a lot of our foundational principles are longstanding missiological practices that people have used around the world for a long time. We've just not used to sort of employing them in our Western inherited patterns of church. So, for instance, we talk a lot about the person of peace principle, which is an established missiological principle, but it's also what Jesus talked about in Matthew 10 and Luke 10. When he sent out the disciples, he told them to look for the people of peace. And so, when Kathleen starts a group around baking sourdough bread, what she's looking for in that moment is who are the people of peace, right? And Jesus says, when you find the person of peace, like, you stay with them, and they invite you to stay with them. And that's where sort of the door of the gospel begins to open. And I think it's interesting, Jesus told us that the stay put part is because you can grow something from that. Mm. So we call that, in the broader sense, we talk about the blended ecology of church, like, typical Sunday morning, inherited patterns of worship that have been happening for, decades or centuries, happening alongside these more incarnational, entrepreneurial expressions of church that are really engaging with people who are far from the gospel and far from church. And these can happen simultaneously. So, Kathleen's giving examples of that. And they can also happen synergistically, which is where, and you heard her allude to it, sometimes people do find, like, life in Christ and life in faith. And then they find that the more inherited patterns of church meet needs or have resources or opportunities that they didn't have in their small community of 15 or 20 people. So we really try to advocate that these things happen synergistically alongside one another. You're not trying to force everyone in the one group to be in the other one, just like you're not trying to force everyone in the church to have a missionary calling into their community, but you're inviting people in both directions.
I'm hearing a little bit of Paul becoming a Greek to the Greek, a Jew to the Jew. Is that a little bit, but building off of interests I already have, or hobbies, skills, whatever it might be?
Yeah, it's very much, the oikos principle from the New Testament. And, what's the common shared household, right? So for a long time in America and New England, that was geographic, right? And so our oikos was those who lived in our town, because, we all rode on horses, and we couldn't get very far. But as things have developed over the last couple of decades and centuries, our home, our oikos, our network tends to not just be geographic, right? And we have these micro interests. So we say you start where people are, just like you said, to the Jews, to the Greeks, the Greek. And so to the bakers, we bake, to the cyclists, we ride, because that's the door of entry. Leslie Newbegin had a well-known statement about basically that the Christian community is the converting principle to faith. And but the challenge, of course, in the Western Church in North America is we've kept the Christian community rather insulated unto itself. So Fresh Expressions is trying to take the church out into the world, to go with to help the church move in action out into the world, so that the Christian community is going out to where people actually are.
So, but you're asking me, and so I'm interested in, let's use our sourdough example. Let's pretend I know something about sourdough. And and I know some people who are interested in sourdough. You're asking me to kind of start a church, and I can do a lot of sourdough stuff, but I don't know anything about starting a church or leading a devotion or anything like that. So how do you help the average congregant then with the skills and the gifting and the mind shift about how to do something like this?
Yeah. Kathleen, you want to take a stab at that?
So at Fresh Expressions, we do have a lot of training to help people to learn how to do that. And this isn't supposed to be driven by the pastor. This really can be done by anybody who is in the church. And so we have lots of books and trainings and stuff like that to help people along in their Fresh Expressions journey. Because yes, this is a new concept to a lot of people, and it takes a little while to wrap your head around it.
Because there's a part of this is that at some point in this process, our desire is I'm now being exposed to enough things of Jesus that I get saved. And then I need discipling too.
Yep.
Exactly.
And that's all still coming through this new sourdough group that we've created.
Correct.
Yeah, I would say that's the vehicle, but this is where the intersecting connection with the existing congregation can often be helpful. So, for instance, I'm going to assume there's a number of churches in and around New England that use Alpha for any variety of reasons, right? Yeah. Many of the struggles that I have known about with Alpha over in the U.S. in particular are really related to churches getting actual non-Christians into Alpha or new Christians. Most Alpha groups are full of people who go to church already, and a lot of churches use it almost as a catechism. A catechal process. But so you say you have a sourdough group and people start to come to faith, and you have an Alpha community. Well, you can just bring Alpha into the sourdough group, right? So there's of course lots of disciple making mechanisms that churches have, that different traditions have. But again, a lot of times we say, come at 5:00 on Sunday for our disciple making evening class, right? Instead of taking those same principles out into, the community, out into the world. But they can be done just as much out in the world as they can be, in the church. But people do need that equipping, training, coaching to help them learn to translate and articulate what it is that they're used to getting in sort of church speak into genuine relationships with people who are new to faith.
And we in the church have to get our heads around, I presume, that thing you're doing on Friday morning at 9:00 is actually church too, depending on, when it gets to a point of, I don't know if we can use the word maturity, if that's a fair word, but at some point that's church too for some people, not Sunday morning. Is that?
Yep, absolutely. Yep. And I think what I always encourage people of is all churches are in the process of maturing, right? So First Baptist Londonderry is in the process of maturing. Celebration Church is in the process of maturing. Dirt Church is in the process of maturing, right? So we're all in the process of maturing. So the question really is, what direction are we heading? And are we helping people grow up to the next phase? And the recognition that a lot of our, patterns and practices and programs in the more existing church are just really hard for people to access. And they're harder all the time because of the lack of Christian foundation, knowledge, understanding that, I would imagine in New England is at least a generation, if not 2 generations removed from the general population.
Yeah. And is Fresh Expressions as something that so we've got a church today, things are going well, however we define well. Is this a program we tack onto it? Is this a new thing we tack onto it? Or is like, no, you can't, this is a whole new model of church we're talking about?
Again, I'd say it's very scalable. So, and this is a question that we get a lot. Some say, hey, we seem like we're growing, or in more cases, we're steady, right? Our attendance is steady. Our engagement is steady. Very few churches are actually growing. So why do we need to do something new? Well, the question really comes, well, who are you not reaching? Who are you not reaching? And the easiest illustration that I have given to people for 15 years is to ask people in any group, what percentage of you have your main worship gathering on Sunday morning between the hours of 9 and noon? And invariably, 95 to even 98% of any room raises their hand. Yep. And then I say, and did you know that 1/3 of all people work on Sunday mornings? Right? So even just the time we've already established, we're already missing huge swaths of any population.
And during hunting season in some of the states in New England, right? Now you're up to 3/3 pretty fast.
Yeah. So I'd say, there are some churches who this becomes a new operating system or a new engine for them, where it's like, the life of the church has developed to the point where they are starting and sustaining multiple fresh expressions and developing, what we call this blended ecology of congregational life and mission. For some, they'll just start with, hey, well, we think we could start a dinner church over here because we know we're going to reach a totally different group of people. We know many dinner churches that are larger than their parent church. Their parent church might be reaching 15, 20, 30 people, and they start a dinner church and they're reaching 75 people because they're just reaching people who are, as Verlin Fosner heads up our dinner church initiative, would say, they're around the corner, but they're not coming around to your corner.
And dinner churches, similar concept of what we're talking about. It's just people who decided to have dinner together with now adding other components to it.
Yep.
And so I'm hearing in this that any church can use this as a strategy. Maybe that's a fair way to say it, as opposed to, no, I've got to, everything we're doing, we got to put on the block now and figure out what's going to start, change. This becomes, no, this is a strategy for reaching people who aren't in your church today. What are the big, and so for folks on our radio program, I see 2 heads nodding. So I know
absolutely.
I'm on the right track.
I affirm what you're saying. And in fact, when I first went to England to explore this in 2007, that is the number one thing that I took away that made the team that I was with come back and say, we need to initiate this in North America and in the U.S. in particular at that time, because I just saw its applicability. Churches that were, 200, 2,000, 20, all able to do this. Churches that were 2 years old, and of course in the UK context, 1,000 years old, are able to put this into practice.
What's the biggest obstacle to a church putting this into practice?
Well, I would say the number one obstacle is that we have to deal with our scarcity mentality. This is the mentality that we already don't have enough people. We already don't have enough resources. How can we afford to release people who are in our pews or on our committees or in our councils to be engaged in mission and ministry through our church, but outside of our church programs and structures? And that, I think, is the number one barrier that people have to get over, is the idea that we don't have enough, This actually doesn't take a lot, except time and investment.
Yeah. Well, and if you think about it, right, what we see so often in our work is if this is something I really enjoy doing, it's not, Kathleen, I know you're busy. We're trying to get this thing going. Would you please? Right. It becomes, we see this over and over again, that organically people raise their hand if it's something I love doing already. So if you're talking about getting people together who like to bake, right, that's not hard for somebody who loves to bake to do. Right.
And I do it all the time, and I use it as a way to connect with people. And so I think if we're trying to, if we're actually using the passions that people already have, I think it's a good segue, because if you're passionate about that thing and you're passionate about Jesus, like, you're just putting them together.
Yep. It becomes organic and folks just want to do it, and it's natural. Where can folks go to learn more?
Freshexpressions.com is where I would suggest you start. We have lots of free resources on there. We have 3 podcasts. One is Fresh Expressions podcast. We have a Dinner Church podcast. And my husband, Chris, and we co-host the Rural Renewal podcast. And so those are some great resources for people who are just starting to get interested. There's books on there as well that you can purchase. But people can reach out to me. My email address is kathleen.blackey@freshexpressions.com, and I would be happy to help direct them in any way I can.
Thanks. That's freshexpressions.com. And if you can't find Kathleen through that, let us know and we'll get you connected too. Kathleen, Chris, thanks so much for being with us today. And thanks for your ministry and these really innovative ideas to reach New England. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you.
To support this program and accelerate evangelism, go to visionnewengland.org and click on Donate, or click Member to become a partner with us. This program is supported by the Palau Association, who are dedicated to proclaiming the good news, uniting the church, and impacting cities worldwide.
At Leadership Transformations, we believe that when you have the right resources to help you slow down and experience a deep and refreshing connection to God, you can become the discerning leader you know you are created to be. Friends, Steve Macchia here, and I have a free gift for your soul. It's called Pathways. Pathways is our weekly email aimed at offering you soul-nourishing content for the journey. It contains readings, prayers, spiritual practices, a link to the Discerning Leader podcast, as well as information about all of our upcoming soul care retreats, workshops, and online offerings. So head on over to leadershiptransformations.org today and sign up for this free resource. It will help you slow down and be more. God bless you, friends.